Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we will venture into the shadows of Tennessee's Great Smoky Mountains, where something horrific happened to a young woman named Clara Hensley in 1911. Before we start, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Let's uncover this mystery together, a mystery that has stayed unresolved for more than 100 years. It was the year 1911. The Great Smoky Mountains towered imposingly along the Tennessee-North Carolina border, perpetually wrapped in a mist that gave the area its name. Those mountains concealed ancient secrets, and during that freezing winter, they would witness an event capable of making even the bravest individuals shudder. Sevier County in eastern Tennessee was a secluded place where small communities existed, scattered across deep valleys and steep slopes. The roads were poor, often just dirt paths that turned to mud when it rained. Life was tough and simple. Families survived on subsistence farming, hunting, and small local trade. At that time, Tennessee still carried the profound scars of the Civil War, which had concluded decades earlier. Reconstruction had been a slow and painful process. Many mountain communities remained largely cut off from the rest of the nation, living by their own age-old rules and traditions. The rule of law arrived slowly in these mountains, if it arrived at all. Sheriffs had enormous territories to patrol on horseback, and crimes could go unreported for weeks or even months before any authority took notice. Clara Hensley was just 19 when her macabre story began to unfold. She was the daughter of humble farmers living on a remote homestead near the town of Gatlinburg, a tiny settlement barely marked on maps back then. Clara was known for her calm beauty and her light eyes, which stood out against her dark hair. According to later accounts from neighbors, she was a quiet, obedient, and dedicated girl. She assisted her mother with housework, looked after her younger brothers and sisters, and seldom left the family's land. The Hensley family resided in a log cabin built in the traditional Appalachian style, with a clapboard roof and a large stone chimney. The homestead was situated in a clearing encircled by dense forests of oak, pine, and maple. In winter, snow covered the mountains, making the isolation even more complete. Visitors were a rarity. The closest neighbors lived almost 2 miles away, separated by rough and hazardous terrain. In late January of that year, something altered the family's peaceful routine. Clara began to exhibit strange behavior. Based on later testimonies from relatives, she would gaze vacantly out the window at the mountains, as if expecting something or someone. At night, she would wake up terrified, speaking of nightmares she could not fully describe. Clara's concerned mother put it down to the severe winter and the monotony of isolated living. But something deeper was occurring, something no one in the family could completely grasp. Historical records of the case are fragmented and were assembled years later from interviews with people who knew the family. Sevier County kept poor records at the time, and many documents were lost or damaged over the years. What we know comes mainly from oral histories that were eventually written down, a few notes from the local sheriff, and brief articles published in regional newspapers weeks after the initial events. During the first week of February, Clara vanished. She simply was not in the cabin when the family awoke on a frigid Tuesday morning. Her bed was empty, the covers thrown back as if she had left in haste. No coat was missing. No boots were gone from beside the door. It was as if Clara had walked out wearing only her nightgown in the dead of a Smoky Mountain winter, where nighttime temperatures easily dropped below freezing. Clara's father, Thomas Hensley, immediately organized a search. He and his older children combed the property, calling Clara's name and checking every part of the surrounding woods. Other neighbors were summoned. Men on horseback traveled familiar trails, inspecting abandoned barns and empty cabins scattered through the mountains. For 3 straight days, search parties scoured the area, without finding a single trace of the young woman. Snow had fallen the night she disappeared, covering any tracks Clara might have left. The searchers found only silence and a cold wind whistling through the pine trees. The Smoky Mountains seemed to have swallowed the young woman whole, leaving no sign behind. The Sevier County Sheriff, a man named William Thornton, was notified only 4 days after her disappearance. The distance between the Hensley homestead and the county seat in Sevierville was great, and communication depended on messengers on horseback. By the time Thornton finally arrived, it was too late to preserve any evidence. The sheriff questioned the family in detail. Clara's mother, shattered by her daughter's disappearance, recounted the strange behavior of the previous weeks. She spoke of the nightmares, the girl's distant stare, and how Clara seemed to be waiting for something. One of the younger brothers mentioned hearing Clara talking to herself in the barn a few days earlier, as if speaking to someone invisible. Another brother said Clara had mentioned recurring dreams about a figure in the mountains calling her name. Thornton wrote everything down in his worn leather notebook, but his investigative capabilities were extremely limited. There were no specialized detectives, no forensic technology, and not even photographers to document the scene. The investigation would rely entirely on eyewitness accounts, analysis of the terrain, and the luck of finding anything concrete. The sheriff organized new, more extensive searches, this time covering areas farther from the property. Groups of volunteers explored deep valleys, known caves in the region, and even an old abandoned cemetery high on a nearby hill. 3 weeks passed without any discovery. The Hensley family sank into quiet despair. Clara's mother rarely left her bed, consumed by grief. Thomas Hensley continued to go out every day to look for his daughter, even after others had given up. He walked the same trails repeatedly, as if sheer determination could make Clara magically appear among the trees. The local community began to whisper theories. Some said Clara had run off with a secret lover, though no one knew of any man who had shown interest in her. Others spoke in hushed tones about mountain creatures and ancient legends of the Cherokee people, who had inhabited the region before being driven out decades earlier. The Smoky Mountains have always been cloaked in dark history. The Cherokee spoke of spirits dwelling in the deepest valleys, of places forbidden after dark. Later settlers kept these superstitions alive, adding their own European beliefs about witches, demons, and supernatural beings. In 1911, many people in the region still held a firm belief in the supernatural, especially in the more isolated areas where churches and formal schooling were scarce. In late February, a trapper named Elijah Porter made a disturbing discovery. Porter was checking his traps in a remote area about 5 miles from the Hensley property when he noticed something odd hanging from a low branch of an ancient oak tree. It was a piece of white fabric, dirty and torn. Upon closer inspection, Porter realized it was part of a woman's nightgown. The fabric was stained with something dark that could have been mud or dried blood, impossible to determine for sure due to the material's deteriorated condition. Porter immediately took the fabric to Sheriff Thornton. Clara's mother confirmed that the nightgown her daughter was wearing the night she disappeared was made from exactly that kind of fabric. White and simple, hand-sewn with a specific pattern she had created. The discovery reignited the search. Thornton organized a large group of men to thoroughly comb the area where the fabric had been found. It was a particularly inhospitable zone, full of deep ravines and thick vegetation. Very few people ventured there, even in daylight. For 2 days, the searchers examined every inch of that forest. They found a few more fragments of white fabric scattered in different spots, as if Clara had run through the bushes and her nightgown had been ripped by the branches. But there was no body, no other clothing, no further concrete evidence of what might have happened to the young woman. The fragments seemed to lead toward an even more remote part of the mountains, but then they simply stopped. There was nothing beyond that point. The absence of a body made everything even more agonizing for the family. With no remains to bury and no clear explanation of what had occurred, the Hensleys were trapped in a painful limbo between hope and mourning. Thomas continued to insist that his daughter was alive somewhere and that she would come home. His wife, however, began to accept that something terrible had happened, though she could not imagine exactly what. In March, as the snow began to melt and spring tentatively arrived in the mountains, new disturbing reports surfaced. A woman named Martha Grayson, who lived a few miles from the Hensley property, approached Sheriff Thornton with a strange tale. She said that on the night before Clara disappeared, she had been awakened by the sound of distant screams coming from the mountains. They were not ordinary screams of fear, but something different. Something she described as an unearthly wail that made the dogs on her property howl in distress. Martha had not mentioned it before because she feared sounding insane. But now, with the fabric fragments found, she felt compelled to share what she had heard. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Jacob Whitfield, also came forward with information he had kept to himself. He told the sheriff that a few months before the disappearance, he had seen a strange man lurking on trails near the Hensley property. He was a tall, unkempt man, dressed in dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that hid much of his face. Whitfield said he greeted the stranger, but received no reply. The man simply kept walking up the trail, disappearing into the trees. At the time, Whitfield had not thought much of the encounter, but now he wondered if this mysterious man could be connected to Clara's disappearance. Thornton looked into this new information, but reached a dead end. No one else had seen the strange man Whitfield described. As for the screams Martha Grayson heard, it was impossible to determine if they were related to Clara or were simply natural forest sounds amplified by imagination on a winter night. The Smoky Mountains were known for creating acoustic illusions, with the wind producing noises that sometimes resembled human voices or animal cries. As the weeks went by, the official investigation began to lose momentum. Sheriff Thornton had other cases to solve and other responsibilities in a vast, difficult county to patrol. He kept the case open, but his visits to the area decreased. The volunteers who had helped with the search returned to their daily lives. Life moved on for everyone except the Hensley family, who remained paralyzed by the tragedy. In April, an event occurred that dramatically brought the case back into public attention. A 12-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell, who lived on a nearby farm, disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. She also vanished overnight, leaving her home without taking any clothes or personal items. Her bed was found empty in the morning, the covers thrown aside, exactly as had happened with Clara. The Mitchell family alerted the authorities immediately, and this time the response was faster. Sheriff Thornton arrived on the scene the same day, bringing a larger group of men to begin the search at once. The community was thrown into a panic. 2 young women had disappeared in less than 3 months, both from the same area, both mysteriously vanishing overnight. People began locking their doors more carefully, watching their daughters obsessively. Meetings were held in local churches, where preachers spoke of the evil that had taken hold in the mountains. Some believed it was the work of a human predator. Others insisted supernatural forces were at play. An atmosphere of fear was palpable in every home and every conversation. The search for Sarah Mitchell was intense from the start. More than 50 men combed the woods around the property. Dogs were brought in from other areas to try to pick up the girl's scent. For the first 2 days, they found absolutely nothing. It was as if Sarah had vanished into thin air, just as Clara had before her. But on the 3rd day, one of the tracking dogs began barking loudly near a deep ravine covered in thick vegetation. The men rushed to the spot. The ravine was dangerous, with steep walls and loose rocks that could cause fatal falls. At the bottom, partially hidden by bushes and fallen branches, lay something white. The men climbed down carefully, using ropes for support. As they got closer, they discovered it was a torn and dirty nightgown. It was not Sarah's body, just her discarded clothing. The family confirmed it was indeed the nightgown the girl had been wearing when she disappeared. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why only the clothes? Where was Sarah? What had happened in that ravine? The men continued searching the area, checking every nook and cranny, every crack in the rocks, every space under the roots of ancient trees. They found a few strands of blonde hair caught on branches, matching Sarah's, but no body, no other significant evidence. It was as if someone or something had taken the girls from that place, leaving behind only fragments of their clothing as macabre reminders. Sheriff Thornton began connecting the dots between the two cases. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Two young women, both disappearing overnight, both leaving only their nightgowns behind, in remote mountain locations. He started to seriously consider the possibility that a predator was operating in the region, someone who knew the terrain well and knew how to move through the mountains unseen. Thornton sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, asking if they had reported similar disappearances. The replies took weeks to arrive, but when they did, they brought disturbing information. In Blount County, just to the south, a 17-year-old girl had vanished in December 1911, just 2 months before Clara. In another county to the north, another girl had disappeared in November of that same year. In both cases, the circumstances were eerily similar. Nighttime disappearances, nightgowns left behind, no bodies found. The sheriffs in those counties had treated the cases as isolated incidents, never imagining they might be linked to a larger series of disappearances. Thornton realized he was dealing with something much bigger and more sinister than he had initially thought. 4 girls had disappeared within a 6-month period, all from the same mountainous region, all following the same macabre pattern. He called a meeting with the sheriffs of neighboring counties to discuss a coordinated investigation strategy. Cooperation between jurisdictions was rare in those days, but the gravity of the situation demanded extraordinary measures. While the authorities organized, the community took its own measures. Vigilante groups were formed in several locations. Armed men patrolled the roads and trails at night, determined to protect their families. Some residents began leaving the mountains entirely, moving to larger towns where they felt safer. Others locked themselves inside their homes as soon as the sun set, praying that the evil plaguing the region would not come to their door. In May of 1911, an unexpected event brought a shocking twist to the case. A lumberjack named Henry Blackwood was working in a remote area near the Little Pigeon River when he came across something that chilled him to the bone. Partially buried under leaves and branches, he saw what appeared to be human bones. Blackwood marked the location and hurried to notify the authorities. When Thornton arrived with a team, they began carefully excavating the area. What they uncovered was both a relief and a horror. There were indeed human remains, but they were not recent. A doctor brought from Sevierville examined the bones and estimated they belonged to an individual who had died at least 5 or 6 years earlier. Most importantly, the skeletal structure suggested an adult, likely male. It was not Clara. It was not Sarah. It was not any of the missing girls. Yet the discovery raised a disturbing question. How many more secrets did those mountains conceal? How many other people had vanished there over the years without anyone knowing? The investigation of the remains yielded no clues. There was no way to identify the person. No documents, personal items, or anything else that could provide a hint to their identity. The bones were eventually buried in the local cemetery, a simple wooden cross marking the grave of an unknown soul. But this discovery deepened the fear already gripping the region. The Smoky Mountains, with their misty beauty and ancient forests, revealed themselves as a far more dangerous place than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, the search for the missing girls continued without success. Weeks turned into months. Summer arrived in the mountains, bringing humid heat and violent storms. Trails became more accessible, allowing searches in areas that had been unreachable during winter. Volunteer groups still went out regularly, scouring deep caves, hidden valleys, and regions where few dared to venture. But they found nothing except wilderness and silence. Thomas Hensley, Clara's father, became a tragic figure in the community. He had aged years in just months. His hair turned completely white, his hands trembled constantly, and his eyes held a profound sadness beyond description. He still went out every day to search for his daughter, walking the same trails obsessively, shouting Clara's name to the indifferent trees. People began to avoid him, not out of cruelty, but because his grief was so intense, it became unbearable to witness. In June, new testimony emerged that brought momentary hope, followed by even greater frustration. A traveling salesman named Robert Hayes, who moved between small communities selling goods, approached Sheriff Thornton with an intriguing story. Hayes said that in early February, a few days after Clara's disappearance, he had spent the night in an abandoned mountain cabin to shelter from a storm. During the night, he heard strange sounds from the forest. Footsteps, many footsteps, as if several people were walking in a line through the dark woods. Hayes said he hid inside the cabin, watching through a broken window. He could see figures moving among the trees in the faint moonlight. He counted at least 5 or 6 individuals walking silently up the trail. One appeared to be carrying a large bundle wrapped in dark cloth over their shoulders. Hayes could not see enough detail to identify who these people were or what they were carrying. At dawn, he surveyed the area and found fresh footprints in the mud, but did not dare follow the trail alone. He continued his journey and only learned of the disappearances weeks later upon reaching another town. Thornton questioned Hayes in detail, trying to determine the credibility of his account. The salesman described the exact location of the abandoned cabin and the approximate route the figures had taken. The sheriff organized an expedition to that location. They found the cabin Hayes described, old and dilapidated, with a partially collapsed roof. There were indeed signs of recent presence, the remains of a campfire and marks on the dirt floor. They followed the indicated trail up the mountain, entering a particularly remote and dangerous area. The path led them to a place few knew, a narrow valley between 2 rocky outcrops, where sunlight barely reached by day. It was a dark, oppressive place, where even birds seemed scarce. At the bottom of this valley, they found something that sent a chill down the spines of all present. There was an artificial clearing. Trees had been cut down years prior, creating an open space surrounded by dense forest. In the center of this clearing, they discovered the remains of a large fire pit, with stones arranged in a circle around it. Even more disturbing were the markings carved into the bark of the surrounding trees. Strange symbols no one could interpret. Some of the more superstitious men began muttering about rituals and witchcraft. Thornton tried to remain calm and rational, but even he felt deeply unsettled. There was something profoundly wrong about the place, a sense that this space had witnessed terrible things. They searched the entire clearing meticulously. They found fragments of fabric caught on low-hanging branches, similar to those found earlier. They also discovered small bones scattered on the ground, though the doctor accompanying the expedition determined they belonged to animals, likely rabbits or squirrels. They dug at various spots throughout the clearing, searching for anything buried. They found no bodies, but did uncover strange objects buried shallowly: pieces of rope, scraps of clothing, a few metal buttons, and most disturbingly, locks of human hair in varying colors. The hair samples were taken for analysis. Precise scientific comparison was impossible at the time, but the families of the missing girls were consulted. Clara's mother confirmed that one lock of long, dark hair could belong to her daughter. The Mitchell family recognized blonde hair similar to Sarah's. The other locks could not be identified, but their presence suggested there were more victims than those already known. The discovery of the clearing completely changed the direction of the investigation. Thornton was now certain he was not dealing with accidental disappearances or wild animal attacks. There was clear human involvement, possibly multiple individuals working together. The symbols on the trees, the ritual fire pit, the buried objects, everything pointed to something planned and organized. But who were these people? Why were they doing this? And most importantly, where were the girls? Thornton dramatically intensified his investigative efforts. He began questioning locals more aggressively, seeking any information about strange groups or suspicious activity in the mountains. He uncovered long-standing rumors about a sect that had operated in the area decades earlier, a group driven out by the community for practices considered heretical and dangerous. Some elders vaguely remembered stories from their youth about nocturnal rituals and mysterious disappearances. An elderly man named Samuel Frost, in his 70s, told the sheriff a disturbing story. As a boy in the late 1860s, he had heard his own father speak of a group of people living hidden in the remotest parts of the mountains. This group supposedly followed ancient beliefs, blending European pagan traditions with local superstitions. They were said to hold ceremonies during full moons, and that young people from the region occasionally vanished. Eventually, the community organized and drove the group out, burning their cabins and forcing them to leave the area. But Samuel said he always wondered if they had all truly left, or if some had remained hidden, waiting in the shadows. Samuel Frost's story opened terrifying new possibilities. If an organized group had indeed been operating in the mountains for decades, they could have remained hidden all that time, passing their practices down through generations. The Smoky Mountains were vast enough to conceal entire communities in the most remote areas. There were valleys rarely visited, deep caves never fully explored, forests so dense even experienced hunters avoided them. Thornton decided to organize a larger, more ambitious expedition. He gathered over 100 men, including sheriffs and deputies from neighboring counties. Their mission was to systematically search the most remote regions of the mountains for signs of hidden human habitation. They divided the territory into sectors, with each group responsible for a specific area. They took provisions for several days, as some regions to be explored were far from any civilization. The expedition began in early July. The men set out in different directions, following old trails and breaking new ground when necessary. For the first few days, they encountered nothing but wilderness. They saw bears, deer, venomous snakes, and other animals typical of the region. They found some huts abandoned for years, with collapsed roofs and moss-covered walls. They also found traces of old camps, fires extinguished so long ago the ashes had completely mixed with the earth. On the fourth day of the expedition, one group made a significant discovery. They were exploring a particularly difficult-to-access area, following a narrow stream that wound between high cliffs, when they noticed something strange. Fresh axe marks on some trees, indicating someone had passed through not long ago, clearing a path. They followed these marks up the mountain with increasing difficulty as the terrain grew steeper and more dangerous. Eventually, they reached an area that appeared deliberately hidden. Shrubs had been arranged to camouflage the entrance to a small, deep valley. Moving the vegetation aside, they discovered a narrow trail leading inward. They advanced cautiously, weapons drawn, unsure of what they would find. The valley was narrow and shadowy, with rocky walls on either side blocking most sunlight. At the bottom, they found clear signs of recent human occupation. There were 3 small huts, built of rough timber, partially hidden beneath trees. Smoke rose from the chimney of one. The men approached silently, surrounding the structures. When they finally revealed themselves, shouting for anyone inside to come out, a moment of absolute tension followed. Then the door of one hut slowly opened, and a figure emerged. It was an elderly, unkempt woman, with disheveled gray hair and shabby clothes. She looked at the armed men without surprise, as if she had expected this visit. The men entered the huts and found two more people, a thin, middle-aged man with a troubled look, and a younger woman who seemed frightened but did not try to flee. There was no sign of Clara, Sarah, or any of the other missing girls. The men searched the huts thoroughly, checking every corner, under the wooden floors, in the small attics. They found little beyond basic survival items, a few old pots, worn blankets, simple tools, and meager provisions. Thornton questioned the three residents. The elderly woman, who identified herself only as Abigail, said they had lived there for over 20 years, hidden from civilization. She claimed they were part of a larger group driven out of the communities decades ago, exactly as Samuel Frost had described. According to Abigail, they lived peacefully in isolation, disturbing no one. She vehemently denied any involvement in the girls' disappearances, saying they rarely came down from the mountains and avoided contact with others. The man, whose name was Josiah, confirmed Abigail's story, but seemed nervous and evasive. His answers were short, and he avoided direct eye contact. The younger woman, named Ruth, looked terrified and could barely speak. When pressed, she began to cry and said she knew nothing about the missing girls. Thornton was not convinced. There was something off about these people, something his instincts as a seasoned sheriff detected, but he couldn't quite pinpoint. The three were arrested and taken to the Sevierville jail. The descent from the mountains took almost 2 full days, during which they remained mostly silent. Abigail occasionally muttered incomprehensible words that seemed to be from some ancient language or unrecognizable dialect. Josiah kept his gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to interact. Ruth wept silently, curled in on herself. While the prisoners were being transported, other expedition groups continued exploring. They found 2 more huts hidden in different locations. Both had been abandoned for some time, but showed signs of recent occupation. In one of them, they discovered something that brought new horror to the investigation. Buried beneath the wooden floor, wrapped in old, rotting cloth, was a small wooden chest. Inside, they found personal items clearly belonging to different people. A wooden comb with strands of hair still attached, a cheap metal brooch, some decorative buttons, faded hair ribbons, and most disturbingly, a small locket containing a blurry photograph of a young girl. The objects from the chest were taken to the families of the missing girls for identification. Clara's mother immediately recognized the metal brooch. It was a simple but distinctive piece she had given her daughter as a birthday present years before. Clara had worn it often, pinned to her dress collar. Seeing the object again after so many months brought the woman to uncontrollable tears. It was the first concrete evidence that her daughter had indeed passed through that terrible place in the mountains. The Mitchell family also recognized one item, a blue hairband Sarah often wore. The other pieces were not immediately identifiable, but they clearly belonged to other victims. The locket with the photograph was shown to several local residents, but no one could identify the girl in the worn image. This suggested victims from other areas, perhaps more distant counties, or even other states. The extent of what was happening in the Smoky Mountains was beginning to reveal itself as something far larger and more sinister than anyone had imagined. In Sevierville, the 3 prisoners were held in separate cells. Thornton and other officers interrogated them repeatedly for days, trying to extract information about the missing girls. Abigail continued to deny everything, insisting they lived in isolation and knew nothing. Her story remained consistent, but there were gaps that made no sense. How did they survive with so few provisions? Where did the personal items found in their cabins come from? Why did they choose to live in such deliberate hiding? Josiah eventually began to crack under the pressure. During an intense interrogation, he admitted the group did not live in complete isolation, as Abigail had claimed. They occasionally descended from the mountains at night, to gather supplies from barns and storerooms on isolated farms. Sometimes they observed the communities from a distance, studying people's ways of life. When pressed about the personal items, Josiah claimed they were offerings, gifts left by travelers passing through the mountains. But his explanation sounded false and desperate. Ruth, the youngest of the three, was approached differently. A woman from the community, experienced in dealing with traumatized individuals, was brought in to speak with her more gently. Slowly, Ruth began to open up. She explained she had been born in the mountains, the daughter of members of the hidden group. She had never attended school, never lived in a normal home, and never known any other way of life. Abigail was her grandmother, and Josiah was her uncle. There were others in the group, Ruth said, but they moved constantly between different hiding places in the mountains. When asked about the missing girls, Ruth became visibly terrified. Her hands shook, her eyes filled with tears, and she began to mumble, "Please, for forgiveness." She said there were things she had seen, terrible things she couldn't talk about without fearing something bad would happen to her. She spoke of ceremonies during full moon nights, of chants in languages she didn't understand, of hooded figures around campfires. But when pressed for specific details about the girl's fate, Ruth collapsed completely, becoming incoherent. A doctor was called to examine Ruth. He determined the young woman was under extreme psychological stress and recommended temporarily suspending further interrogation. There was real concern that pushing her beyond her limits could cause permanent damage to her already fragile mind. Thornton was frustrated, feeling he was close to obtaining crucial information, but he agreed to give Ruth time to recover. Meanwhile, the mountain expedition expanded even further. News of the discoveries spread, and volunteers from various regions arrived to assist with the search. Newspapers in larger cities like Knoxville began publishing articles about the case, drawing attention to the mysterious disappearances in the Smoky Mountains. Public pressure to solve the case increased dramatically. Families demanded answers, wanting to know what had happened to their daughters. A group of searchers found another clearing similar to the first, also with symbols carved into the trees and the remains of large bonfires. This time, however, there was something more. Digging around the area, they discovered an underground structure, a sort of cellar dug into the earth and reinforced with wood. It was a small, claustrophobic space with a low ceiling and damp walls. Inside, they found chains attached to the walls, dirty blankets thrown on the floor, and desperate scratches on the wood, as if someone had tried to escape using only their fingernails. The discovery of the underground cellar confirmed everyone's worst fears. The girls hadn't simply disappeared or died quickly. They had been held prisoner, locked in that horrific hole in the earth. For how long? What had they suffered there? The chains suggested forced restraint. The scratches on the walls spoke of unimaginable despair. It was difficult for the men who discovered this place to maintain their composure. Some wept openly. Others remained silent, processing the magnitude of the horror they had uncovered. Dried bloodstains were found on the cellar floor. Scraps of fabric similar to those found previously were scattered in the corners. There were also remains of rotting food, indicating the prisoners were fed, kept alive for some purpose. Thornton examined everything meticulously, documenting every detail. This was where the girls had been held before something even worse happened to them. With the discovery of the underground cellar, the investigation took on renewed urgency. Thornton confronted Abigail and Josiah with the new evidence, describing in detail what had been found. For the first time, Abigail's mask of indifference began to crack. She remained silent for long minutes, staring at her wrinkled hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, weaker, almost resigned. She said there were things in the mountains greater than anyone could understand, traditions dating from ancient times, even before settlers arrived in the land. Abigail began to tell a fragmented and disturbing story. Decades ago, her ancestors had fled Europe, bringing with them ancient beliefs the church considered heretical. They believed in natural cycles, in sacrifices necessary to maintain the balance between the worlds of the living and the shadows. When they reached the Appalachian Mountains, they found a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where ancient forces could still be felt and honored. They settled there, practicing their rituals in secret, away from the judgmental eyes of Christian communities. For generations, the group had lived relatively peacefully, performing their ceremonies without outside interference. But as surrounding communities grew and expanded, conflicts became inevitable. People began to notice occasional disappearances, missing livestock, and strange behavior. Eventually, as Samuel Frost had recounted, the community organized and violently expelled the group, burning their homes and threatening to kill anyone who remained. Most fled to other regions, but some, the most devout, simply hid deeper in the mountains, hoping that in time they would be forgotten. Thornton listened with growing horror. He asked directly about the girls. Abigail looked at him with empty eyes and said the chosen ones were necessary for the ceremonies, that they served a greater purpose ordinary mortals could not comprehend. She spoke of nights with a full moon, of chants that opened portals, of offerings needed to appease ancient forces. Her words were a confusing mix of delirious mysticism and veiled admissions of terrible crimes. Josiah, after hearing Abigail speak, finally surrendered completely. He recounted how he had participated in several ceremonies, always reluctant, but unable to challenge the group's elders, especially Abigail, who wielded absolute authority. He described how the girls were taken to the clearings, kept in the underground cellars for days, while the group prepared for the rituals. He didn't give specific details about what happened during the ceremonies, but his words left little to the imagination. The girls didn't survive. Their bodies were treated according to the group's ancient traditions. When asked about the location of the bodies, Josiah said they were taken to sacred places in the mountains, deep caves, where they supposedly rested in eternal peace. He provided approximate directions to some of these caves, though he admitted there were many such sites scattered throughout the Smoky Mountains, and that he was not familiar with them all. The task of finding the girls' remains would be monumental, potentially impossible, given the region's vast territory and complex geography. Ruth was spared further intense interrogation after her earlier breakdown, but she voluntarily asked to speak to Thornton a few days later. She said she wanted to tell the truth, that she could no longer carry the weight of the secrets she had kept her entire life. Ruth confirmed Abigail and Josiah's stories, but added painful personal details. She had known some of the captured girls, and had even spoken briefly with Clara when she was imprisoned in the cellar. Ruth brought food to the prisoners, a task assigned to her precisely because she was young and less threatening. Clara, according to Ruth, had begged for help, promising that Ruth wouldn't be punished if she freed her. But Ruth, terrified of the consequences of disobeying the elders, had done nothing. She wept as she told this, saying Clara's face haunted her every night, that she saw those desperate eyes every time she closed her own. Ruth said she wanted to help find the bodies, that the families could bury their daughters properly, that she wanted to somehow atone for the sins she carried. With the information provided by the 3 prisoners, new expeditions were organized to locate the aforementioned caves. It was now August, and the summer heat made hiking through the mountains even more exhausting. The groups followed Josiah and Ruth's directions, delving into parts of the Smoky Mountains few had explored before. Some caves were small and shallow, revealing nothing but rock and darkness. Others were complex tunnel systems, extending deep into the mountains. In one of these larger caves, located in a particularly remote area, near the peak of a high mountain, the searchers made the discovery everyone had feared, but knew was inevitable. Using torches to illuminate the dank darkness, they advanced through narrow tunnels until they reached a larger chamber at the back of the cave. There, arranged in a strangely organized fashion, were the remains of multiple people. The bones had been cleaned and arranged, some wrapped in ancient cloth, others simply placed in natural niches in the rock walls. A doctor and a mortician were brought in to examine the remains. They determined there were at least 8 different sets of human bones in the cave, all from young individuals based on size and bone development. Some of the remains were older, perhaps several years old. Others were more recent, possibly months old. Among the more recent bones, they found fragments of fabric that matched the descriptions of the clothing Clara and Sarah were wearing when they disappeared. The confirmation that Clara and Sarah were dead hit their families like a devastating blow. Although they had expected the worst after so many months, the final reality was unbearable. Clara's mother had to be sedated by a doctor, so intense was her reaction upon receiving the news. Thomas Hensley, who had maintained stubborn hope all that time, finally collapsed. The man who had spent months roaming the mountains calling his daughter's name now no longer had the strength to even stand. The Mitchell family reacted with a mixture of profound grief and intense anger. Sarah's father, a normally calm and religious man, publicly declared that justice must be served, that those responsible must pay for what they did. His voice trembled with suppressed emotion as he spoke of how Sarah would never have the chance to grow up, marry, have children, live the life she deserved. He demanded that authorities find all members of the group hiding in the mountains and bring them before the law. Thornton intensified efforts to locate other members of the group. Ruth had mentioned there were at least 6 or 7 other people living in different hideouts throughout the mountains. She provided physical descriptions and names when she could remember, though many in the group used only nicknames or ritual names that changed over time. The manhunt spread throughout the region. Posters were distributed in towns and villages, urging anyone who saw suspicious individuals in remote areas to report them immediately to the authorities. In September, 2 additional members of the group were captured, attempting to steal supplies from a store on the outskirts of Gatlinburg during the night. They were a middle-aged man and a middle-aged woman, both in poor physical condition, obviously living in difficult circumstances in the mountains. When confronted, they attempted to flee but were quickly subdued. Taken in for questioning, they initially refused to talk, but eventually confirmed their participation in the group and its rituals. They provided the locations of additional caves where bodies might be hidden. Other caves were explored in the following weeks. Each revealed more remains, more evidence of the horror that had unfolded in the Smoky Mountains over years, possibly decades. The total number of victims was impossible to determine precisely, as some bones were so old and impossible to identify. Conservative estimates suggested at least 15 to 20 victims over time. The reality could be much worse, considering some caves would likely never be found. The remains identified as belonging to Clara and Sarah were returned to their families for proper burial. Funerals were held in local churches, with entire communities attending to pay their respects and support the grieving families. Sermons spoke of stolen innocence, the evil that can lurk even in the most beautiful places, and the importance of remaining vigilant against darkness. Clara was buried in the small cemetery of the church her family attended, beneath an oak tree that provided shade during the summer. Sarah was buried next to her grandparents, with a simple headstone marking her brief passage through life. The trial of the captured members of the group began in October 1911. It was one of the most sensational cases Sevier County had ever seen. The courtroom was packed every day with people traveling long distances to attend the proceedings. Abigail, Josiah, Ruth, and the other 2 captured later faced multiple charges of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The prosecution presented physical evidence found in the mountains, the defendant's own testimonies, and accounts from the victims' families. The defense argued the defendants were living by their sincere beliefs, however strange, and that they didn't understand they were violating the laws of civilized society. They tried to paint the group as people deeply disoriented by their isolated traditions, not as conscious criminals. This argument failed to convince the jury. The evidence was overwhelming. The crimes were too horrific to be excused by cultural or religious differences. Ruth received special treatment during the trial due to her age, her cooperation with authorities, and the evident psychological trauma she had suffered. Her lawyer argued she had been both a victim and a perpetrator, raised from birth in an environment of abuse and manipulation. The court considered these factors. While she was found guilty of complicity in the crimes, her sentence was significantly lighter than that of the others. Abigail was considered the leader of the group and the person primarily responsible for the atrocities. She showed little remorse throughout the trial, occasionally muttering about sacred traditions and cosmic necessities no one else understood. Josiah and the other two captured members were also found guilty on all counts. The sentences were severe. Abigail and Josiah were sentenced to death by hanging. The other two received life sentences. Ruth was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years if she showed good behavior. The executions of Abigail and Josiah took place in November 1911 at the county jail in Sevierville. Abigail walked to the gallows without resistance, remaining silent until the last moment. Josiah was visibly terrified, shaking uncontrollably as he was led to the scaffold. When the lever was pulled and the trapdoors opened, their lives ended quickly. Many members of the community watched the executions, feeling a mixture of satisfaction that justice had been served and profound sadness for all that had happened. Even after the arrests and executions, questions remained unanswered. How many other members of the group were still hiding in the mountains? Had they all been found, or were some still out there practicing their dark rituals? Had all the victims been located, or were there still bodies waiting to be discovered in unexplored caves? These questions haunted Thornton and others involved in the investigation. The following years brought significant changes to the Great Smoky Mountains region. The Clara Hensley case and the revelations about the group hiding in the mountains left deep scars on the community. Families who had lived there for generations began to question what they truly knew about these ancient mountains. Stories about the case spread far beyond Tennessee, reaching newspapers in major cities like New York and Chicago. The Great Smoky Mountains, once known primarily for their natural beauty and characteristic fog, now carried a dark reputation that drove away some visitors while attracting others fascinated by the macabre. Thomas Hensley never truly recovered from the loss of Clara. He continued to live on the same property where his daughter had grown up, but he became a shadow of the man he had been. Neighbors reported seeing him walking the trails at dawn, still searching for something he would never find. His obsession didn't diminish with time. It just changed in nature. Instead of searching for Clara alive, he now roamed the mountains, as if trying to understand what had happened, as if the trees and rocks could give him answers the courts failed to provide. He died just 3 years later, in 1914, heartbroken according to the doctor who attended his final moments. He was buried next to Clara, finally reunited in death, since they had not been able to be together in life. Sarah Mitchell's mother also never got over the tragedy. She moved away from the area a year after her daughter's burial, unable to continue living so close to the mountains that had taken her child. Every time she looked out the window and saw those misty peaks on the horizon, she felt a physical pain in her chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing her heart. She spent the rest of her days with distant relatives in another part of Tennessee, rarely speaking of what had happened. When anyone mentioned the Smoky Mountains in her presence, she would turn pale and immediately change the subject. When she passed away many years later, her will specifically requested that she be buried far from that area, in soil where she could finally find peace away from the memories that had tormented her for decades. Ruth served her sentence with exemplary behavior. During her years in prison, she learned to read and write, something she had never had the opportunity to do while living and hiding in the mountains. She received religious education from missionaries who visited the prison regularly, finding comfort in Christian scriptures that contrasted sharply with the dark beliefs of her childhood. The nuns who worked with her reported that Ruth frequently suffered from nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, reliving the horrific scenes she had witnessed. She attended counseling sessions, trying to process the trauma of a lifetime lived under the domination of people who practiced macabre rituals. She was released in 1921 after 10 years of incarceration. She legally changed her name and left Tennessee completely, traveling west where no one knew her story. She never married, never had children, always fearful that the darkness she had known might somehow be passed on to a new generation. She worked simple jobs, lived a modest and anonymous life, carrying her secrets in silence. Decades later, shortly before her death in 1962, Ruth left a detailed diary describing her experiences, a document that would eventually make its way into the Tennessee Historical Archives, providing additional details about the group and its practices that had not been revealed during the trial. In the years following the trial, occasional expeditions were still organized to explore additional caves in the mountains. More remains were found sporadically throughout the 1910s. In 1913, an expedition discovered another cave with 5 sets of bones, all from victims who were never identified. In 1916, hunters stumbled upon a shallow burial site where 3 bodies had been deposited, so decomposed that it was impossible to determine when they had died or who they were. Each discovery reopened old wounds in the community, reminding everyone of the evil that had existed so close to their homes. Eventually, official searches ceased around 1920, when authorities decided they had done all that was humanly possible, but hunters and explorers continued to occasionally stumble upon disturbing evidence in the most remote parts of the mountains for decades to come. There were occasional reports of bones being found, of strange objects discovered in deep caves, of places in the mountains where people felt an inexplicable instinctive fear of entering. Sheriff William Thornton remained in office for several more years after the case. The investigation had consumed him so much physically and emotionally that he was never the same man again. He had seen things no human being should see, uncovered horrors that defied rational comprehension. His wife reported that he rarely slept well, often waking in the middle of the night and sitting in the kitchen until dawn, smoking his pipe and staring into space. In 1915, he decided to retire prematurely at the age of 53. Passing the badge to a younger successor, Thornton spent his final years living modestly in a small house in Sevierville, rarely speaking about the case that had defined his career. When asked about the events of 1911, he usually just shook his head and changed the subject. He kept a personal file with all the notes and documents related to the case, documents he revisited occasionally as if searching for something he might have missed, some clue he might have overlooked. When he died in 1928, his obituary in the local newspaper described him as the man who had brought justice to the Smoky Mountains. Though those who knew him well knew he never felt true, justice had been achieved. The Great Smoky Mountains continued to attract visitors over the following decades. The region underwent significant transformations in the 20th century. In 1934, much of the area was designated the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, one of the most visited national parks in the United States. Millions of people now hike these trails every year, admiring the natural beauty, crystal-clear waterfalls, impressive biodiversity, and spectacular views of the misty peaks. Families picnic in clearings where macabre rituals may have been performed decades earlier. Children play near caves that may hold dark, undiscovered secrets. Few modern visitors know about the events of 1911, about the young women who disappeared in those forests, about the rituals performed in hidden places. Official records exist in dusty archives in Sevier, Blount, and other counties, rarely consulted, slowly being forgotten by time. A few local historians know the story, and occasional articles appear in regional publications recounting the events. But for most visitors to the mountains, it remains merely a forgotten story, an obscure footnote in the region's history. However, there are those who believe that not all members of the group were captured. Ruth mentioned in her diary that there were at least 3 people she knew who were never found by authorities. She didn't provide names or detailed descriptions, possibly out of fear even decades later, or perhaps because she genuinely didn't know their true identities. There have been occasional reports over the years of people seeing strange figures in the more remote parts of the park, people who disappear when approached, as if they knew every trail and every hiding place in those mountains. In 1957, a group of Boy Scouts camping in a remote area of the park reported seeing hooded figures around a campfire during the night. When the adult leaders investigated in the morning, they found only cold ash and strange symbols scratched into the earth, similar to those described in the 1911 reports. Park authorities investigated, but found nothing conclusive. The incident was filed away as a possible prank or practical joke. In 1973, a young woman disappeared while hiking alone in a secluded area of the park. Extensive searches were conducted, but she was never found. Officially, the case remains open as an unsolved disappearance, possibly the result of an accident or disorientation in the dense forest. But some familiar with the area's history couldn't help but draw comparisons to the events of 1911. There was something about the circumstances that seemed to echo the dark past of those mountains. We cannot know for sure whether these later incidents have any real connection to the group of 1911, or whether they are simply coincidences amplified by a familiar story. The mountains are vast and dangerous. People get lost, accidents happen, and sometimes nature simply reclaims what is its own. But the possibility remains, haunting the imagination, that perhaps something of that ancient darkness still lingers in the unexplored depths of the Great Smoky Mountains. But we haven't forgotten the confirmed victims. This story, as disturbing as it is, needs to be remembered and told. Clara Hensley was only 19 when her life was brutally cut short. She had dreams, hopes, people who loved her deeply. Sarah Mitchell was only 12, a child with her whole life ahead of her, with so much unrealized potential. The other victims, whose names we often don't even know, also deserved to live their lives fully, to realize their dreams, to grow old surrounded by love and family. Instead, their lives ended in terror and absolute darkness, their bodies hidden in cold caves where no one could hear their desperate cries for help. The case reminds us of the fragility of human life, especially in times when the law was slow to reach remote places and isolation could hide the worst crimes imaginable. It reminds us that evil can disguise itself in many forms, even under the cloak of ancient traditions and spiritual beliefs that sound innocent on the surface. And it reminds us of the critical importance of remaining vigilant, of protecting the vulnerable in our communities, of never ignoring the signs that something is terribly wrong, even when those signs seem unlikely or hard to believe. The Smoky Mountains hold their secrets to this day, shrouded in the characteristic mist that gives the region its name. How many unexplored caves still exist in those rocky depths? How many stories remain untold, buried under decades of silence and oblivion? How many additional victims might be resting in places no human has visited in decades, or perhaps centuries? We will likely never know all the answers to these troubling questions, but we can honor the memory of Clara, Sarah, and all the other confirmed victims by telling their stories faithfully, ensuring they are not completely forgotten by the relentless march of time. If this journey through one of the darkest cases in American history touched you in any way, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on what you heard today. Subscribe to the channel for more disturbing and mysterious stories from American history that deserve to be told and remembered. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos, where we'll continue delving into the darkest and most inexplicable cases this country has ever witnessed. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey through the shadows of the past.